History often pivots on moments no one could have foreseen. Sometimes it is an unlikely alliance, a single order spoken at the perfect instant, or even one thunderous cannon shot that sets the course for nations. In the autumn of 1781, on a quiet peninsula in Virginia, such a moment unfolded. There, the mighty British Empire confronted a power it never fully understood, one that not only humbled its red-coated regiments, but also laid the foundation for a new country. This is the lesser-told story of Yorktown, the British Army's final stand, and the hidden weapon that secured America's independence. Picture the battlefield in October 1781, the ground trembling beneath your boots, the wind heavy with the sting of gunpowder, soldiers standing in long, weary lines with resolve etched across their faces. It's something about this battle was unlike anything the British had encountered, something they never anticipated, something that would change the war's direction forever. Most people remember Yorktown as the dramatic finale of the American Revolution, but only a few understand why the British Army, considered virtually unbeatable in its era, collapsed so suddenly. Their downfall wasn't simply due to courageous charges or clever tactics. A far more decisive force blindsided them, one that can only be understood by stepping back and viewing the conflict on a wider stage. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 relentless years. The American colonists fought a desperate struggle against an empire that controlled seas and continents. The Redcoats, disciplined, well-trained, armed with the finest equipment of the age, symbolized unmatched military strength. Their officers were products of Europe's elite academies, and the British Navy dominated the world's trade routes and oceans. The Americans, by contrast, were something entirely different. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and students who had traded their daily lives for muskets, many better suited for hunting than for war. Their forces were a patchwork of local militias, undersupplied volunteers, and inexperienced young men. The early years of the war were filled with setbacks. New York fell, Philadelphia was captured, and the dream of independence seemed doomed. Then in 1778, everything shifted. France, still nursing wounds from its loss to Britain in the 7 Years' War, chose to intervene on the colonist side. That alliance redrew the map of war. France sent troops, weapons, and supplies, yes, but their most powerful contribution was something far greater: control of the sea, a navy capable of challenging Britain's maritime supremacy. By the summer of 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis had fortified his army in the small town of Yorktown between the York and James rivers. He built strong defenses, redoubts, trenches, earthworks, believing he could withstand any siege. His reasoning seemed sound. Without a navy, the Americans could never completely surround him. British ships could always bring reinforcements or evacuate his men. What Cornwallis didn't know was that an extraordinary operation was already unfolding. Near New York, George Washington and French commander Rochambeau were crafting a daring plan, one that required flawless synchronization between land forces and naval power, a near impossibility in the 18th century. Washington had long considered attacking New York, but everything changed when he learned that Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse was sailing from the Caribbean with a massive French fleet. De Grasse commanded 28 ships of the line, floating fortresses armed with rows of cannons. These giants could turn the sea itself into a barrier stronger than any wall. And their destination was not New York at all, but the Chesapeake Bay, directly where Cornwallis had entrenched himself. Britain had no idea that its greatest advantage, naval dominance, was about to vanish. That was the secret weapon, French naval supremacy. Not a new machine, not a clever trick, but sheer control of the ocean, cutting supply lines, blocking escape routes, and sealing Cornwallis inside a trap. But the plan required immense risk. Washington had to move his entire army from New York to Virginia, nearly 600 kilometers, without letting the British discover his real intention. If they did, they could strike him during the march or save Cornwallis in time. So Washington turned to deception. He ordered fake bread ovens built, staged mock reconnaissance missions, and even allowed false intelligence to slip into British hands. Meanwhile, his men quietly marched southward. In August 1781, American and French troops began their long journey. More than 12,000 soldiers crossed rivers, mountains, towns, and forests in a logistical feat that still astonishes historians. And all the while, British command in New York remained convinced they were the next target. By the time they understood the truth, Washington was far ahead, and the French fleet controlled the bay. On September 5, 1781, British Admiral Thomas Graves reached the Chesapeake expecting to sail in unhindered. Instead, he found de Grasse's towering warships barring the entrance. The clash that followed, the Battle of the Virginia Capes, was a deafening eruption of smoke and thunder that shook the Atlantic. After hours of combat, the British withdrew. France had won absolute control of the sea. Cornwallis was now isolated. Trapped in Yorktown with roughly 7,000 men, he faced over 16,000 American and French troops under Washington and Rochambeau. The siege began in late September. Trenches were dug forward each night, artillery batteries multiplied, and the encirclement tightened. The French brought more than naval might. They brought the finest engineers and artillerists in Europe. Their 8-, 12-, and 24-pound guns were masterpieces of warfare, capable of tearing through British defenses with terrifying precision. On the night of October 6th, Allied troops quietly dug the first siege line. At dawn, a trench stretching over 3 kilometers pointed straight toward the British works. 3 days later, the guns roared to life. Washington lit the first fuse himself. The shot arced across the sky and crashed onto a table where British officers were dining, killing one instantly. The bombardment had begun. 50 cannons thundered in unison. The earth quaked, the sky glowed red, and British positions began to crumble. Their walls buckled under relentless fire. Yet before the Allies could finish the noose, they needed to seize 2 crucial outposts, Redoubts 9 and 10. No more deception, no more waiting, only the final assault that would decide the fate of 2 nations. The night of October 14th, 1781 became a threshold between 2 worlds, a moment in which the future of entire empires clung to a fragile thread. The siege of Yorktown had drained the British defenders to the bone. Their walls were collapsing, their men barely remained upright, and the cannons that once roared with authority now sat in suffocating silence. Only 2 small outposts, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, still clung to life, like the last broken fangs of a giant unable to bite. Washington understood the truth with absolute clarity. Once those positions fell, the war would be all but decided. That same night, beneath a pale moon washed by drifting smoke, the commander-in-chief issued the order that would shape a nation's future. 2 synchronized assaults, fast, silent, merciless. The Americans would storm Redoubt 10 under the leadership of a young, driven officer, Alexander Hamilton, whose name would later become inseparable from the financial foundations of the United States. The French, led by the disciplined Baron of Viominil, would strike Redoubt 9. Everything rested on speed, secrecy, and raw courage. Muskets were to remain silent unless absolutely necessary. This was to be a battle fought largely with steel and determination. At precisely 8 o'clock, the signal was given. Hamilton's men moved like phantoms through the darkness. British sentries caught the movement and fired, but too late, the Americans were already scaling the walls with axes and ladders, carving their way through chaos. In moments, the night exploded into a frenzy of shouts, clashing metal, and swirling shadows. Within minutes, Redoubt 10 was in American hands. Meanwhile, the French advanced toward Redoubt 9 with a precision that bordered on the mechanical, rows of men moving with one unified heartbeat. The British offered determined resistance, but the pressure was overwhelming. In less than half an hour, both strongholds had fallen. The heart of Yorktown lay exposed. For Cornwallis, the loss was devastating. With the redoubts gone, Allied engineers completed their second siege line, placing artillery so near the British defenses that survival itself became impossible. Hemmed in by land and sea, the British general saw the truth. There was no escape. He considered his final options. A breakout by land was madness. The Allied armies encircled him entirely. An evacuation by sea? Equally hopeless. The French Navy ruled the waters, and the remaining British vessels were in no condition to sail. Still, in a final act of desperation, Cornwallis attempted one last gamble. On the night of October 16th, as fierce winds battered the peninsula, he ordered his troops to cross the York River and escape northward. Against all odds, the first boats reached the opposite bank. But then nature seemed to take sides. A violent storm crashed down, shredding boats, hurling them against rocks, and turning the river into a deadly trap. Those who had crossed became stranded, and by daylight, under enemy fire, they had no choice but to return. With the collapse of that escape attempt, the war was effectively over. Inside Yorktown, nothing remained to fight for. British troops were exhausted, ill, and starving. Powder smoke mingled with the stench of disease. As Allied artillery intensified, even the most loyal officers could no longer deny the truth. The position was untenable. At dawn on October 17th, exactly 4 years after the American triumph at Saratoga, a lone figure appeared amidst the British ruins. A drummer stepped onto a shattered parapet and beat the call for negotiation. Allied cannons thundered on it first, then one by one fell silent. A British officer emerged with a white flag and a letter from Cornwallis requesting a ceasefire and surrender terms. Washington granted just 2 hours for proposals. Messages raced back and forth through the night until finally, on October 18th, delegates convened at the modest Moore House, one of the few buildings still standing. There, the terms were set. Washington remained firm but fair. The British would surrender their weapons and be treated as prisoners of war. Officers would keep their swords, soldiers their personal belongings. But a symbolic condition remained. No British flags unfurled, no national marches played. It was repayment for the humiliation inflicted on Americans at Charleston. Then, on October 19th, 1781, beneath a clear sky, the ceremony began. 2 long columns, one American, one French, formed a corridor of triumph. Between them marched the defeated British army. Cornwallis, claiming illness, refused to attend. His second-in-command, Charles O'Hara, approached to offer surrender. He first turned to Rochambeau, perhaps seeking a gentler reception. The French commander, with polite firmness, directed him to Washington. But Washington adhered to protocol and motioned toward General Benjamin Lincoln, his own second-in-command. It was Lincoln who formally accepted Britain's defeat. The Redcoats advanced silently, stacking their muskets. Some wept openly, some smashed their weapons in frustration. Their band played a mournful tune, the world turned upside down. And indeed, the world had shifted. The mightiest empire on earth had bowed before a coalition of farmers, craftsmen, and dreamers. More than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their arms. Hundreds of cannons and thousands of muskets were seized, but the true impact was psychological and political. When news reached London, Prime Minister Lord North reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." He was right. Though the war would linger until the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Yorktown extinguished Britain's last glimmer of hope. The real engine behind the victory was not a single miraculous weapon, but a combination of formidable forces: French military science, naval dominance, and a remarkable alliance between France and the United States. The French brought more than manpower. They delivered expertise, engineering, calculations of wind and trajectory, and artillery precision unmatched in Europe. Their bronze and iron guns were masterfully crafted, calibrated for specific ranges and conditions. Mortars arced shells with mathematical accuracy, guided by charts of distance and wind. Explosions shattered not only structures, but morale. British soldiers later described nights when the ground felt alive beneath them, shaking endlessly as shells screamed overhead. Hunger, illness, and despair to the rest. The British were defeated not only by force, but by exactness. French gunners worked like a single living organism. They switched ammunition with astonishing speed, solid shot for walls, grape shot for infantry, incendiaries to sow fear. Every battery fired with intention. Every shot counted. And when the last cannon fell silent, something greater than a siege had ended. A new chapter for humanity had begun. European science and American idealism had joined to reshape the world. Yorktown was more than a victory. It was a message to the ages. No tyranny lasts forever, and once the flame of freedom is lit, it refuses to die. As the cannons quieted and smoke drifted across the ruins of Yorktown, the battlefield seemed to tell its own story, one not only of triumph, but of ingenuity, partnership, and human cost. Behind every blast of artillery, behind each trench carved into the damp earth, worked another army, one often unseen. The engineers, the planners, the craftsmen who, with ropes, spades, measurements, and relentless patience, carved the path toward victory. Among all the forces that shaped Yorktown's fate, few proved more decisive than the French engineers. They were the silent architects of the triumph, men who could turn sodden ground into a weapon of war. Every rampart, every artillery platform, every zigzag trench was their creation, built on discipline and a tradition of knowledge passed down through generations. They understood how to make the very soil fight on their side, transforming wood, clay, and sweat into both shield and sword. The art of siegecraft was their domain. They studied the ground, measured the contours, tested the soil's moisture, even calculated the effect of night winds. Trenches needed to conceal troops from enemy fire, yet resist collapse under rain. They had to be wide enough for artillery to move, but narrow enough to dig swiftly under pressure. Their designs were pure military geometry, angled lines that confused defenders, batteries positioned to support one another, and communication trenches where men and supplies flowed like the lifeblood of the army. Thousands of soldiers toiled under moonlight, the metallic rhythm of shovels striking hard-packed earth echoing while British cannonballs rained down with no mercy. Still, the advance never stopped. Guided by seasoned French engineers, the trenches crept forward using decades-old European techniques. They moved under fire behind towering gabions, huge wicker baskets filled with dirt serving as mobile shields. With bundles of sticks called fascines and wooden cylinders packed with earth, they reinforced walls again and again. Nothing about this work was swift or glorious. It was steady, deliberate, and unstoppable. Without them, the siege could not have been sustained. Without the French fleet, Cornwallis would have slipped away. Without their artillery, the British walls might have endured. And without French troops, Washington could never have sealed the circle around Yorktown. Yet the victory was not theirs alone. American soldiers fought with fierce resolve. Hamilton's lightning assault on Redoubt 10 remains one of the boldest feats of the entire war. And at the center of everything stood Washington, balancing diplomacy, strategy, and the fragile spirit of his army. He became a bridge between worlds, between French precision and American improvisation, between seasoned veterans and raw volunteers. The Franco-American alliance was, in truth, a miracle of cooperation. Language, manners, and military customs divided them. The French valued ceremony. The Americans favored flexibility. Arguments arose, tempers flared, but the mission bound them together. Rochambeau, experienced, calm, and politically astute, never tried to overshadow Washington. He understood the revolution belonged to the Americans, and his respect allowed the alliance to flourish. His subtle diplomacy was as vital as any troop movement. And then there was the man who tilted the war's balance entirely, Admiral de Grasse. By choosing to sail toward Chesapeake Bay rather than New York, he sealed Cornwallis's fate. His fleet carried troops, guns, and supplies, won a decisive naval battle, and transformed Yorktown into an inescapable trap. He risked everything and won everything. Looking back, it becomes clear how fragile the entire operation truly was. Had de Grasse arrived days later, Cornwallis might have escaped. Had the storm not destroyed his attempted river crossing, the war might have dragged on. Had the British in New York uncovered Washington's deception earlier, history could have taken a different turn. History often pivots on threads so thin they are nearly invisible. A delayed message, an unexpected wind, a commander's hesitation. At Yorktown, all these threads aligned perfectly. The consequences stretched far beyond the Virginian shores. For America, Yorktown marked the birth of a nation rooted not in monarchy, but in principles. Soon these ideals would appear in the Constitution, inspiring revolutions and democracies across continents. Words like liberty and equality, once whispered in rebellion, began to resonate around the world. For France, the victory came at tremendous cost. Supporting the American cause deepened the financial crisis that would one day ignite the French Revolution. Many soldiers returned not only with scars, but with new visions of freedom and citizenship. For Britain, Yorktown was a painful humiliation, but not demise. Still, it forced a realization: no empire can indefinitely suppress a people determined to govern themselves. Over time, Britain's imperial policy grew more pragmatic, more cautious. Yorktown also marked a turning point in the marriage of science and warfare. French artillery, the most advanced on the planet, proved that a battle could be shaped by mathematics as much as by bravery. It heralded an age in which engineering would stand beside valor as an essential force in war. The naval triumph at Chesapeake left lessons that echoed for decades. Control of the sea could decide the fate of entire armies. That truth would later help inspire the birth of the United States Navy. Perhaps the most revolutionary accomplishment was the flawless coordination between land and sea. Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse achieved a synchrony few commanders had ever matched. Their operations became the blueprint for modern joint warfare. Yet beyond strategy, Yorktown carries a deeper message: the endurance of the human spirit. For 6 years, Americans endured hunger, defeat, and despair. They lost cities, homes, and loved ones, yet they refused to surrender. Washington embodied this perseverance, leading his army through brutal winters and impossible choices. Because ultimately, Yorktown was not merely a clash of armies, it was a clash of ideals. The men who fought there defended principles: freedom, equality, and the right to carve their own fate. They challenged the greatest empire of their age and proved that an idea, once ignited, can be stronger than steel. The British learned that lesson amid the ashes. A territory can be conquered, but the conviction of a people longing for freedom cannot. And with distance, the true secret weapon behind the fall of the Redcoats becomes unmistakable. It wasn't only the French fleet, nor the unmatched artillery, nor even Washington's leadership or Rochambeau's steady wisdom. It was the union of wills, courage joined with knowledge, determination bound to hope, a shared belief that a more just world could be built. That was the force that echoed through Yorktown. And it remains the same force that continues to shape history today.